This is Shane Schick, and this is my poem Early Riser from the Wondrous Real Magazine. I'm painting a portrait of before because it's beautiful. Walking city streets and clutching fistfuls of air, which has the freshness of a popsicle just pulled out of the freezer. Cabs gliding by lazily, like waiters circling tables to see who's looked over their menus. Sidewalks, imminently covered in shoes, enjoy gazing up greedily at the entirety of a cloudless sky. The lights of office towers glowing warmer, savoring a few more seconds of freedom from brewing coffee-colored shadows. Stores keeping doors and windows closed, like blankets pulled over their heads as they sleep in just a little longer. This is the zigzag dance you make through the seats of a theater that's hours away from welcoming an audience. The point prior to the pouring of the pancake batter that will smell the beginning of breakfast. The smile of the prospector who arrives to pan for the gold ahead of anyone else. An almost giddy opportunity to trespass streets nicknamed Almost, Just About, and Soon. My background is actually as a journalist. I kind of spent most of my career as a reporter covering different kinds of news, often kind of stuff about business and technology. And as I'd always been reading poetry, and I realized at one point that in a way, writing poetry and reading poetry is kind of like a different form of reporting. Instead of reporting on something that just happened, it's kind of reporting on something that is eternal or has like kind of a connection to life that is almost always there. And so I'm inspired by the idea of kind of walking through the world and trying to notice things that maybe we all kind of know happen or see happen or feel happen, but that we don't really stop and think about them. And so it's a way of kind of freezing those things in a way that hopefully inspires people or makes them laugh or comforts them or just gives them a sense of what life is like. Yeah, so like a lot of people who, in the first while when I was writing poetry, I focused mostly on form poetry, on, ones that rhyme and ones that were, that followed a certain kind of structure. And I wanted to get away from that a little bit and understand how to write free verse poetry. And this was actually one of the first times I ever felt I did that successfully. It was on the morning of New Year's Eve in 2019, and I had to run downtown. And I was walking through the financial district of the city I live in, Toronto, and I just sort of had this funny feeling about that moment in time, and I realized it was just kind of no one was up yet. There was still that sense of what was going to happen, over the course of the rest of the day, and just some of the lines that I ended up using just sort of came into my head, and I just was really inspired about just capturing that sense of waking up early and what that feels like. And I guess to me, the poem is really a poem about hope. We always have that catchphrase, tomorrow is another day. And I wanted to write about what that other day, feels like at the very beginning, because I feel like that's the point where everything is still full of possibility. There's a bit of excitement, and I just felt really happy. And a lot of my poems are fairly joyous, rather than kind of sad or super introspective. And so I decided free verse was the best way to write it, and that's really how it's laid out. Just sort of no rhyme scheme or structure. It's just sort of free flowing from beginning to end. Yeah, for me, they usually just kind of begin often when I'm walking around or moving, sometimes when I'm sitting down. But, in this case, I was walking down the street and, just had these lines. Some of the first lines started to come into my head, and this often happens. I kind of almost scrambled to find a place to sit down. I think I ran into a food court somewhere and pulled out my laptop and started writing stuff down right away. And for me, I usually write poems, from beginning to end in one sitting. And I'll revise them a little bit, but usually it's all kind of done in one session. I don't usually take days or weeks to come back to them. Most often, fortunately, it comes pretty readily when it comes. And so I like to try to just get all the ideas out there and just put them on the page as quickly as possible, and then just tweak it until I feel like it sounds about right. And usually I feel pretty confident about that. There's a lot of the same advice that I'm sure you've heard in a lot of these kinds of interviews. But one thing that I found has been helpful for me when if I feel at all sort of stuck on how to move forward is to kind of think of it less as you're writing something that's just for yourself or something that's kind of almost like a diary, and not to think of it as writing to the whole entire world, but to think about writing it just to one particular person in your life. In my case, a lot of the poems I write are written really to my wife. They may not be about her or have anything to do with like a memory that we shared, but they're often, she's often, the first person I'm thinking about when I first start writing. And so if you read things that I've written that have, you in them, she's often the you. And I think that's true for a lot of other poets. They kind of have had a way to, there's really that desire to express something strongly when you're trying to get it across to a specific person. And so it can be a way of just forgetting about everything else and just that desire to communicate, which is what poetry is fundamentally about. Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems is people will read a poem and sort of get to the end of it and think, well, what was this about? And I think when you start reading a poem, the best way to go into it is not to think that you're going to be reading a story. It doesn't have to tell a story. It doesn't have to make some giant universal point. My advice would be to approach looking, to approach reading a poem in much the same way that you might look at a painting in a gallery. Some paintings you look at and you can immediately see it's showing a scene of some kind or other, if it's a realistic painting, or maybe an old painting from the Renaissance. But there's a lot of abstract paintings where really you're just kind of looking around the canvas and a shape kind of catches your eye, or a color, or a combination of those things, and it makes you feel a certain way. And I think you need to approach poetry the same way. Just read it and see if there is an image that relates to something that you recognize in your own life, or the way that words sound together in the poem maybe just ring a little bit differently. Like maybe they almost give you a feeling, kind of like the feeling when you're listening to music. Does it make you see something in a different way, or that it makes you realize that you've seen something, every day, and not really stop to look at it. Those are the kind of things that you should be thinking about when you read a poem, rather than looking for one central point, or trying to get a sense of a narrative. That's usually not what poets are trying to do. They're really trying to capture a slice of life, as it happened, or as they witnessed it, or even just as it passed through their mind. And that's the way that I try to read poems. And usually when I do, if I read a good one, there's kind of this moment of like, oh my goodness, where I feel like they've noticed something or recognized something that maybe only I thought about or noticed. And that's a wonderful feeling, because you realize you're connecting to the person that wrote it, even if they lived, hundreds of years ago, or live, thousands of miles away. Yeah, this is a really difficult question, because there's so many, and I decided not to recommend something that I think is incredibly famous, but something that's by a living poet who I think he could use as much, you know, renown as possible. He's got a very difficult to pronounce name. It's an Irish name. His name is Padraig Utuama, and the poem is called "How to Be Alone." And it's a great poem because it kind of walks through what it's like to kind of grow up and to mature and how to essentially become comfortable with who you are, which I think is something we all, go through. And I'll just quickly, there's one stanza in it in particular that I think kind of shows why it's exemplary, where he says, "There will be a party where you feel like nobody's paying you attention. And there will be a party where attention's all you get. What you need to do is to know how to talk to yourself between these parties." And I love that because it reminded me of when I was young and probably more insecure. And even, now there's moments where you kind of feel like that. And I think he does such a great job of crystallizing that and just making you feel more comfortable with yourself. And it's a great, it has an almost spiritual feel to it. So I'd highly recommend it. Yeah, I'm still working as a journalist by day, and so I am the founder of a magazine about kind of a new discipline called customer experience design, and the publication is called 360magazine.com, and it's the only money I get from it is through people who pay to read it through paid subscription. So anyone who's in the business or tech world or anything like that, who are marketing and who's interested, I would love them to check it out and consider, becoming a subscriber. But otherwise, I'd also love it if they, read more of my poems, and you can read those at shaneschick.com/poetry.